In today's video, I will discuss the key lesson, the key takeaway from the Kargil conflict. And why it is important to discuss that is because even today it resonates and impacts the thinking of the present Indian military leadership. Now, plenty has been written in the last 25 years. Both the top commanders of both sides, they have written their account of the conflict. On the Pakistan side, we have General Musharraf. He has devoted an entire chapter in his book In the Line of Fire to Kargil. On the Indian side, we have the then army chief, who was the chairman chiefs of staff. Also, General Ved Malik, he has written an entire book on Kargil called Kargil from Surprise to Victory. Now, I have read all this. When I went through General Malik's book, I realized there was one sentence which was in italics in the entire book. And that single sentence, according to the general, obviously, is the key doctrinal takeaway of the Kargil conflict. And that is what I wish to discuss today. And here is the sentence. I need to read that first. General Malik wrote in the book, Kargil was a limited conventional war under the nuclear shadow, where space below the threshold was available, but it had to be exploited carefully. 3 points he makes in this one sentence. One, he calls Kargil a limited conventional war. Then he says, number two, that both sides had nuclear weapon. There was a nuclear shadow. So now the space for the conventional war had become limited. And therefore, he makes the third point, it has to be exploited carefully. All three need to be discussed. Let me start with Kargil being a limited conventional war, because this is what everybody in India calls. Well, it was not a war at all. Kargil was not a war. I argue it was a conflict. Because in a war, all the sides which are involved in a war, they bring their entire military might into the game, which was not the case in Kargil, because we know on the Pakistan side, the Pakistan Air Force, the Pakistan Navy, they were not even in the loop. All Musharraf brought into the game was 5 battalions. A battalion is roughly 1000 soldiers of his then paramilitary force, Northern Light Infantry. And of course, after the war, the NLI, Northern Light Infantry, was converted into a regular army. And also, if we read the book, in his book, he says that some elements, it was about a brigade. A brigade from Mangla, which is under Rawalpindi Corps, it was given to the Siachen commander. And then, of course, the Mujahids were there, which they call freedom fighters. Bulk of the Pakistan army, his corps commanders, they were not even in the loop. So, this is what came in the game from the Pakistan side. Now, on the Indian side, we know what came to Kargil was a little more than 4 infantry division. That means around 50,000 soldiers were brought in that small space. Then we know, very important, 100 artillery guns were brought in Kargil, denuding the strike cause of the Indian army. It was a huge gamble taken by Army Chief Ved Malik, because if Musharraf was prepared for a war, then he could have exploited those huge operational gaps to his advantage. No army chief should take a gamble like that. Not only that, the guns were brought, 100 guns were brought, artillery. Many of them were put in a direct firing role. In a war, you cannot do that if the other side's air force is active and the air defense is active, which obviously was not the case here. Then, despite this being the case, where so little came from the other side, from the Pakistan side, at the height of the war, when General Malik was asked a question, his response was, and you could sense the helplessness in his response, he said, we will fight with whatever we have. That means there was a shortage of spares, there was a shortage of ammunition, there was a shortage of the entire war withal. And the evidence of that was the papers of the day at that time. They carried accounts every day. There were accounts of bureaucrats of the Ministry of Defense carrying suitcases with dollars, going shopping around the world collecting spares and ammunition. So this cannot be called a war. It was a conflict. And it is important to understand it was a conflict because it was then an aberration. You cannot draw any doctrinal lessons from an aberration. But this was not the case with the military officers. Now, a very interesting thing happened there during Kargil. All the three services of India, Army, Air Force, Navy, they did their own operations. The Army operation was called Operation Vijay, the Air Force operation was called Operation Safed Sagar, and then we know after the conflict, the Navy said that, hey, look, even we were ready for war, and our operation was called Operation Talwar. So after the conflict, the wisdom that came out was that, look, they all should have worked together. If they had worked together under one operation, the Army, Air Force and the Navy, especially the Army and the Air Force, then more could have been achieved with less. Optimization would have been done, and hence this thinking that jointness is required. It was put as part of the lesson learned of the Kargil, and in 2002 we know there was a report of the government that came out, group of ministers report, which suggested that there is a need for jointness and there is a need for a chief of defense staff to do the jointness. Now, 22 years later, Modi government came to power. They were quite happy with the army chief, General Bipin Rawat. And once Bipin Rawat was to retire, they wanted to retain Rawat because he was ideologically inclined with the BJP party. So they dug up that report, the group of minister report, something that was written 22 years back, and said, okay, we are doing this reform and now there will be a chief of defense staff. Everybody was happy. This is a mistake. Why a mistake? As I explained in my video yesterday, the war has changed in 22 years. The science of war, the art of war, both have changed. More technologies have come in, and to exploit those technologies, new war concepts have come in. In the cutting edge of war of today, as I explained yesterday, the PLA has physical, it has physical domains, it has virtual domains, and everything has to be put together for jointness. Now, as far as the Indian military is concerned, we still have the Army, Air Force and Navy. Nothing else has been added. No virtual domains have been added. So what is the sense of making a jointness here? What is the sense of saying, by Bipin Rawat, now it has been taken forward by his successor, Anil Chauhan, that the key reform today needed is theaterization, integrated theatres. We need jointness and we need synergy. Now, when you have only 3 physical domains, then each physical domain has their core competencies. And if they are to exploit the core competencies, and given the fact that the Indian military, all the 3 services, they have limited assets, then they cannot be joined because the outcome will be suboptimal. So instead of talking of theatre commands, which is a takeaway of 22 years lesson, what should be done today is you create virtual domains and you create software networks. By software networks, what you do is you get better coordination. So the focus should be on coordination, not on jointness, but this is a different subject. So this was my first point about Kargil not being a war. Now assume that Kargil actually was a limited conventional war. Now what does the limited conventional war mean? There is nothing called a limited conventional war, because when a war is joined, everything will depend on what is the war aim. Why is it that the two sides are going to war? What is their war aim and what is the war control that they will exercise? So that will determine the duration of the war. How can you assume that it will be a limited war? But this is still the case, because recently we know that this Ukraine-Russia war is going on, The CDS Anil Chauhan and the Army Chief Manoj Pandey, they were asked at two separate television interactions that what is the big takeaway, one of the big takeaways from Ukraine, and they said, well, we used to think that war will be shorter, it will be limited, but now we think it can be longer. I mean, that's an entirely different setup. So you cannot say that once a war is joined, then it has a dynamic of its own. There's nothing called a limited war. That's my first point. Second is, he talks of nuclear shadow and the threshold of conventional war having been reduced. Disagree with this entirely. And I'll give you examples. Let us take the India-Pakistan example first. My argument is that when two militaries are matched or nearly matched. Now what I am saying is that Indian and Pakistan militaries are matched. I am not talking of their national power being matched. Please don't confuse the two. And why I am saying they are matched is because in all the wars that India and Pakistan they have fought, the military line which was created on 1st of January 1949 continues to exist. First as the ceasefire line and then as the line of control. The Indian military was never strong enough to obliterate that line. After each war that we fought in the western sector, I am talking of western sector only, there was always a bit give and take of territory, and the matter was settled. And actually nothing was settled. So when you have two militaries which are nearly matched, then here is my point. Then nuclear and conventional, they need separate deterrence. One does not help the other. You cannot say that there is a nuclear overhang and so this war will be affected like this. No. And here are my examples for that. When India did the nuclear test, within days Pakistan did the nuclear test, and after the nuclear test, despite the pressure of the Americans on the Pakistanis not to follow suit and do the tests of their own, then Pakistan Army Chief Jahangir Karamat made it very clear that nuclear tests are required to maintain parity at the strategic level. So he understood that there is a distinction here, that nuclear deterrence has nothing to do with, it has to be maintained, so has the conventional deterrence to be maintained. Another example, today in Western Pacific, the Chinese are building up their arsenal, nuclear arsenal. Why? They are building up because they know that there is a threat from the US military. And they also know that they have to build a deterrence both at the conventional level as well as the nuclear level, and this is precisely what they are doing, which is why they are building up their nuclear arsenal. Now both these countries, what they are saying, they have learned from their primary source, and the primary source is the Cold War. During the Cold War, please recall in the 50s, when the Soviet Union, they had lot of everything of the conventional arsenal. They had more tanks, they had more aircraft, they had more guns. Now, there was a dilemma for the then US President Eisenhower. He had to take a call. And the call was that should I match tank to tank, gun to gun, what should I do? So he came up what everybody knows is the first offset strategy. And that came to be called as a new look strategy. And he introduced tactical nuclear weapons in the game. The Americans introduced. And the whole idea was that look, the American side, they had more strategic weapons, the big bombs, than the Soviet side had. So if they try, the Soviet side, they try to bulldoze with their conventional capability, they can be stopped by the tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, thank God it was never tested. But this was the thinking. Then by the time 70s came, 1970s, the Americans had to revise their thinking. And why they had to revise is because they realized that the Soviet side, now they had acquired as many big bombs as they had small bombs, the tactical nuclear weapons, and therefore something new had to be done. Because the charm of the tactical nuclear weapon had been lost, because if there is escalation, both sides would have ended up in annihilation. And hence they came up with their second strategy, which was having long range accurate fire, so that we stop the Soviet blitzkrieg, the conventional blitzkrieg, well before it comes to the joining line. Of course, it was never tested against the Soviet. It was tested finally against the Iraqi military in the 1991 war, and the PLA learned the lesson, but that is besides the point. So here is my key point about this nuclear overhang that everybody in the military, the retired and the service, keep talking, that look, the nuclear weapons are there, so the war has to be limited. No, nuclear weapons have their own dynamics. You need between military powers. For example, I'll give you another example, and that is a recent one, which involves PLA and the Indian military. Because the gap in the nuclear deterrence and the conventional deterrence between the two is so huge that the PLA did not even bother about India's nuclear weapon, and they came in May of 2020 and they today occupy our territory in East Ladakh. They have not been deterred by India's nuclear weapons. So let us get this out of our thinking. We have to build this separate. These are not joined, the two deterrents. And number three, third point. Now is being said that, this gap has to be exploited carefully. Well, the Pakistanis are exploiting it very carefully and very well. Starting 1991, when the whole problem started in Jammu and Kashmir, and the Indian army was inducted in large numbers in the theatre, what did the Pakistan Army Chief of the day, General Asif Nawaz Janjua, do? He was worried. He was worried because the Indians had inducted a huge number of soldiers in Jammu Kashmir. He was worried about a sudden attack across the line of control. Therefore, he approached the Americans that these guys may attack us. And we know that then after that the Americans mediated, the Gates mission came to India and Pakistan, and then CBMs were instituted. But after that they have not bothered. The Pakis have not bothered at all about the huge numbers in the Indian theatre. In fact, since 1991 till today, we have been doing counter-terror operations unabated, because they are not bothered of our large numbers, despite the fact that both sides did their nuclear test in 1998. Both sides got the bomb, but that was a separate story altogether. They are not bothered because they know that we do not have conventional war deterrence. That is the gap. The gap is not the nuclear gap. India simply has failed, India's military leadership has failed to build a deterrence at the conventional war, and that is the thing which will deter the proxy war of the Pakistanis. Now, when I say deterrence, what am I talking about? I am talking about three elements, three components. I am talking of capability. Capability is technologies, and how do you optimize the technology with war concept, which is why I made the video yesterday. For God's sake, look there. How do you optimize? What you need, whether symmetrically or asymmetrically, what you need to do. We lack capability. Second is capacity. What is capacity? Capacity is the capability, your capacity is your military industrial complex, which can provide you ammunition, spares, which can provide you arsenal. You see, that we don't have that. Despite all this jumlebaji, this rhetoric of the last 10 years of the Modi government that look, we are Atmanirbhar in defense. The fact of the matter is that in 2023, SIPRI is a very respected think tank in the world based in Sweden. It comes out with their annual report. They have listed very carefully that in 2023, India was the largest importer of arms in the world. And if there are any doubts on this, Then we have our military officers, our CDS, our army chief. Again, they are asked what is the lesson of the Ukraine war, and they say, oh, the big lesson of the Ukraine war is we need to be self-sufficient in the arsenal. Arey Baba, that lesson was of 25 years back when Kargil conflict happened. Didn't you see what this Ved Malik said? That I will fight with whatever I have. So what were you doing this 25 years? You never learned the lesson. So you see, this is all rhetoric, jumlebaji. So that is my second point. We do not have that. And the third point, equally important, is I said capacities, capabilities, and the third is credibility. I dare say, and it is ironic, that whenever the BJP right-wing governments have been there in power, who claim to be the best custodian, better custodian of national security, they actually have never had the gumption to go to war. We saw when Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, Operation Parakram happened. What happened? For 10 months, we wanted to coerce Musharraf. Musharraf was belligerent. He wasn't coerced. Vajpayee got his army back. A lot of damage was done. That is the story I don't want to go into right now. But we lost credibility. Then recently, you see what our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, on the 19th of June 2020, 4 days after the Galwan killing, he made a shocking, astounding statement. The world heard that. He said that nobody is occupying, the PLA is not sitting on India's territory. Please tell me what sort of credibility is left with the PLA, with China and with the world. So credibility is important. We have to build up these three things. So if there is any lesson of the Kargil conflict, it is this. It is not what Ved Malik has said or what the present leadership is thinking. It is, for God's sake, build credibility for conventional war, build credibility for nuclear war. They are separate. Thank you.